The first time the Germans realized something was different about the Canadians was on a morning that began like any other on the Western Front. A thick, chalky mist clung to the hedgerows of Normandy, swallowing sound and light until even the outline of a Panzer seemed to dissolve into the gray. Inside one of those Panzers, crewman Otto Reinhardt sat with his hands resting on the controls, listening to the soft rumble of the engine, waiting for the order to move. He had survived the Eastern Front. He had driven through burning villages, crossed rivers under artillery fire, and watched entire battalions vanish to Soviet tank formations. But in France, he would encounter something he had never faced before. He would face hunters who did not roar or blitz forward. They waited in silence. They struck without warning, and they wore the maple leaf. The Canadians had arrived in Normandy with a growing reputation. After years of fighting in Italy, they had hardened into a force that understood the messy reality of close-range warfare. They lacked the glory-chasing bravado of some units, but they made up for it with a calm, relentless precision that unnerved anyone unlucky enough to face them. While other Allied armies focused on sweeping advances or massed armor tactics, the Canadians had quietly built something unique, a generation of tank hunters who turned the battlefield into a chessboard. They did not fight tanks head-on unless they had no choice. Instead, they stalked steel giants the way trappers stalked wolves. It began long before Normandy. Back in England, during the endless months of training, Canadian officers had noticed something about their men. Many came from farms, logging camps, mining towns, and the harsh northern wilderness. They understood terrain instinctively. They knew how sound traveled across open fields, how to move through brush without snapping a twig, and how to lie still for long stretches of time. When the Canadians were introduced to the PIAT, the heavy, awkward, spring-driven anti-tank launcher that most soldiers cursed at, the reaction was different. Instead of complaining, they experimented. They learned how to fire it from ditches, from windows, from haylofts, even from behind twisted patches of rubble. They studied angles and distances until they could estimate a tank's blind spot by watching how sunlight hit its armor. Lieutenant Marcus Hale, one of the early Canadian instructors, often told new recruits that the pit was not a weapon for the impatient. He held it like a hunter holding a bow and said, "You don't charge with this, you wait. And when your moment comes, you take it without hesitation." His words spread through the ranks until the tank hunter teams began shaping their own identity. They were careful. They were quiet. And they trained for the kind of fighting that Panzer commanders hoped to avoid. By the time the Canadians landed in Normandy, their tank hunters had become something else entirely. The dense hedgerows of the French countryside suited them perfectly. The terrain was claustrophobic, a maze of dirt lanes boxed in by towering earth mounds topped with tangled branches. Tanks hated it. Infantry feared it. But Canadian hunters saw opportunity. A single Piat team positioned along a sunken lane could disable a tank worth more than an entire company's monthly supply of ammunition. And so began the slow, unnerving rise of the silent hunters in the iron fog. On the morning that Otto Reinhardt's Panzer began rolling forward, the crew heard nothing unusual. Birds chirped somewhere beyond the fog. The radio crackled softly. The driver muttered that visibility was poor and suggested they wait for the mist to lift. But the orders from battalion were clear. They were to probe the hedge-lined road ahead and test for Allied positions. Reinhardt wiped condensation from his periscope and scanned the murk. It was impossible to shake the cold feeling that something was wrong. He felt it like a pressure behind his ribs. "Why is it so quiet?" he whispered. 100 meters ahead, 2 Canadian tank hunters waited in a shallow ditch hidden by a curtain of ferns and broken branches. Corporal Daniel Whitaker held the Piet steady on his shoulder, its weight pressing against the bone. His partner, Private Ellis Crane, lay beside him with a pair of binoculars, tracking the faint black silhouette moving through the fog. They barely breathed. Whitaker's fingers were relaxed, not tense. He had done this before. In Sicily, he had taken out a self-propelled gun at night with a single shot. In Italy, he had ambushed a Panzer III from behind a stone wall so narrow he scraped half the paint off his helmet, sliding into position. Now, in Normandy's morning haze, he felt the familiar clarity settle over him. "That's a Mark IV," Crane murmured. "Coming straight down the lane." Whitaker nodded once. "Wait for the angle." They listened to the tank's grinding advance. Every few seconds, the engine roared just loud enough to vibrate the earth beneath their elbows. If the tank turned even slightly, they would lose their chance and likely their lives. The PIAT required courage bordering on madness. Its effective range was painfully short. They had to let a tank come close enough for its rumble to be felt in their chest. The Germans still saw nothing. Inside the Panzer, Reinhardt adjusted a dial and cursed under his breath. "Visibility is useless. We should stop." "We keep moving," the commander replied. "Allied tanks are still regrouping. This is the safest time." Reinhardt wasn't so sure. He leaned closer to the viewing slit and squinted. Shapes twisted in the fog. Shadows merged into hedges. The road looked empty, but he could not shake the sensation that they were being watched. A few meters away, Whitaker's breathing slowed. The tank was almost at the perfect angle. He could see the black cross on the armor, the swaying track skirt brushing the hedge. Crane whispered, "Now." The Piat cracked with a sharp, violent thump that echoed off the hedgerows. The spring recoiled brutally into Whitaker's shoulder. The bomb streaked through the fog and slammed into the Panzer's side armor, sending a storm of flame and metal outwards. Inside the tank, Reinhardt was thrown sideways as the shell tore into the hull. A blinding flash burst across the control panel, followed by choking smoke. The driver screamed that the engine was hit. The commander yelled orders that dissolved into panic as the tank lurched violently. Reinhardt grabbed for the hatch, coughing, blinking tears from his eyes. He felt the unmistakable truth pierce him. Someone out there had been waiting for them. Someone who knew exactly where they would drive. Outside, Whitaker and Crane did not stay to watch the full destruction. Their training was simple: fire, relocate, survive. They sprinted into the hedgerow, disappearing into the greenery before the German crew managed to spill out of the smoking tank. By the time the Germans could orient themselves, the Canadians were gone, leaving only the fading echo of their ambush. Stories like this spread quickly. Panzer crews began whispering about phantom hunters hidden in every ditch and hedge. Officers reported that their tank units hesitated before entering narrow lanes, fearing the silent Canadians lying in wait. Some crews fired machine guns blindly into foliage. Others refused to advance until infantry cleared the route first. The Canadians were not the only Allied tank hunters in Normandy, but they were among the most unnervingly effective. They combined wilderness instinct, mathematical precision, and a weapon that demanded nerve and patience. They turned the battlefield into a hunting ground. As the morning fog lifted and the sun finally cut through the mist, Whitaker and Crane regrouped with the rest of their platoon on a ridge overlooking the valley. The commander praised their work, but Whitaker only nodded quietly. He was not seeking glory. He was doing what he had trained for. Still, he could not deny the strange feeling that settled over him as he watched smoke curl into the sky from the burning Panzer below. He wondered how many more tanks would come, how many more ambushes they would have to set, and how long the fog of war would continue to thicken around them. Behind him, the sound of artillery began to roll in the distance, signaling another German counterattack forming beyond the ridge. Crane tightened the straps on his gear and said, "Looks like they're coming again." Whitaker exhaled slowly. "Then we get ready. They'll expect us to run. They never learn." The Canadians moved into new positions, their silhouettes blending into the landscape as naturally as shadows. The mist still clung to parts of the valley, drifting like smoke from a sleeping giant, and the air carried an uneasy weight. The iron fog was not yet gone, and deeper inside it, new machines were rumbling forward. And before the sun set, the Panzer crews would discover that the silent hunters were far from finished. The Germans called it the creeping dread. It settled into their minds not during battle, but in the quiet moments before an advance, when the engines were warming, maps were unfolded, and officers whispered last-minute orders. There was a point at which every Panzer crewman, no matter how experienced, would stop what he was doing and simply listen. Not for enemy tanks, not for aircraft, for something far more unsettling. The silence. Because somewhere in that silence, hidden in hedges, barns, drainage ditches, and the dark seams of ruined villages, were the Canadians. The ambushes had begun in earnest after the clash in the morning fog. What had started as improvisation by tank hunter teams evolved into a methodical system of fear. The Canadians learned quickly. They studied the German patrol routes, the times Panzer units preferred to probe new ground, and even the armored crews' habits. Certain crews tended to hug the left side of a lane. Others favored stopping at predictable crossroads to reorient. German doctrine stressed momentum and maintaining pressure, which made their movements easier to anticipate. The Canadians transformed these patterns into traps. Lieutenant Marcus Hale stood beside a shattered stone farmhouse one afternoon, chalking diagrams onto a metal ammunition crate. Around him, his tank hunter teams crouched in a semicircle, rifles slung over their shoulders, Piats resting in the grass, and the smell of distant artillery drifting on the breeze. Hale tapped the crate with a stick as he spoke. "A Panzer needs room to maneuver. These lanes give them none. If we control the angles, we control the fight. We choose where they look. We choose when they see us. We decide when they die." Private Ellis Crane glanced at the others. They were tired, dirty, and tense, but they were listening. These tactics were keeping them alive. Hale pointed to 3 rough lines sketched in chalk. "We create false gaps. Make them believe this spot," he tapped the first line, "is where the ambush will be. They'll send infantry to sweep it, so we set our real ambush here." He rapped the second line, "Farther up, where their guard drops. They think they've cleared the danger, so they ease forward. That's when our PIAT teams strike." Whitaker, sitting with his elbows on his knees, grinned faintly. "Trick the hunter into becoming the prey." Hale nodded. "Exactly. And once one tank dies in a lane like this, the rest freeze. They're blind. They're deaf. They start shooting at ghosts." It was not bravado. It was the truth. A few hours later, those tactics were tested when a German reconnaissance group moved cautiously toward a small French hamlet the Canadians had occupied. 2 panzers led the advance, followed by infantry spread along the hedges. The Canadians had deliberately left one corner of the hamlet untouched. A gate lying open, a path between 2 collapsed walls, and a single smashed cart left in plain view. It looked like a natural entry point, a safe one. The Germans took the bait. Inside the village, Whitaker was hiding beneath the broken floorboards of a warehouse. Dust drifted in thin rays of light overhead. Crane crouched behind a half-collapsed staircase, listening to the steady rumble growing closer. Farther down the alley, another team waited behind a tangle of bicycles, crates, and burlap sacks. The Canadians often joked that the battlefield was their canvas and debris was their paint. But the humor rarely lasted long. Once the engines were close enough to shake the stones, the jokes always died. Crane whispered, "They're checking the open path." Whitaker nodded, even though Crane couldn't see him. He could feel the vibrations through his boots, each one crawling up his spine. "They'll move slow," Whitaker murmured. "They think we're waiting at the gate." Beyond the warehouse, the Panzer commander scanned the ruined street through split hatches. He expected trouble, but not here. The walls were low. The path was clear. His infantry signaled that no tripwires or suspicious debris blocked the way. He waved his tank forward. What he didn't know was that the Canadians had reshaped the battlefield long before the Germans arrived. Hale's platoon had spent the night altering the streets, a pile of rubble here, a toppled door there. Broken beams arranged in such a way that they forced the tank to angle slightly to the right as it passed the warehouse. A perfect angle for a PIAT shot. Whitaker watched the tank creep closer. He could hear the grinding of its tracks against the cobblestones, the sigh of its turret rotating slightly as the commander checked the rooftops. He could even hear the steady rhythm of the engine like a breathing beast. He leaned into position, bracing the PIAT against the floorboards. Crane whispered, "2 more seconds." Whitaker exhaled. 1. The first shot thundered through the air. The Piat bomb tore through the thin gap between 2 broken beams and slammed directly into the Panzer's right flank. A flash of flame erupted across the armor. Smoke gushed out from under the turret ring. The German infantry shouted in confusion. Some dove behind walls. Others tried to fire into the windows, unaware that the shot had come from beneath their feet. Whitaker and Crane scrambled to their exit point, slipping through a broken cellar door that led to an alley. They didn't stay to watch. They never did. The second Piat team fired next, striking the Panzer's turret as the driver panicked and tried to turn. The tank lurched sideways, blocking the lane entirely. From the German perspective, the attack was a nightmare. They couldn't see where the shots were coming from. The ground itself seemed alive, spitting fire and death. One moment the lane was clear, the next, it was choked by a burning machine that sealed their only route out. The remaining Panzers stopped immediately. Its commander shouted orders to reverse, but the tank behind them jammed the path. German infantry fired wildly into windows, convinced they saw motion. Some even shot at shadows cast by drifting smoke. The Canadians slipped out the back of the hamlet without losing a man. When the Germans finally retreated, the Panzer crews were shaken. One driver later told his sergeant, "They fight like ghosts. They don't defend, they don't attack, they wait. And then they strike when you cannot breathe." Word spread through German armored divisions. Whenever the Canadians were reported in an area, tank morale plummeted. Crews requested additional infantry escort. Some refused to advance into hedgerows unless artillery had flattened everything ahead of them. Others began firing machine guns into empty lanes just to feel like they were doing something. But the Canadians were not relying on fear alone. Their success came from consistency, coordination, and a deep understanding of terrain. Their ambushes worked because every man knew his role. On one particularly tense evening, Hale gathered his teams at the edge of a forest just as dusk settled. The sky was a deep, bruised blue, and the air smelled of pine. Far off, German engines growled as armor massed for a push. Hale knelt beside a fallen tree and traced another diagram in the dirt. Tonight they'll expect us on the ridge. They've scouted it. They've shelled it. They think we're stubborn. He looked up at the men. We're not. We're going to hit them here, where the forest pinches the road. We'll use the trees to mask our movement. Once we fire, we melt backward into the woods. They'll try to chase us. But the forest belongs to us. Whitaker cracked his knuckles and asked, "How close do we let them get?" Hale didn't hesitate. Close enough to smell the exhaust. The attack that followed became one of the most retold Canadian ambushes of the Normandy campaign. The forest was silent when the German column entered. The canopy swallowed moonlight. The road wound through a tight corridor with trees so close together the tanks brushed their bark. The Canadians were already in position, hidden in pits dug beneath roots, behind fallen trunks, and inside thickets thick enough to hide a full squad. The Germans advanced slowly, beams cutting thin lines through the dark. Then Whitaker's Piat fired the opening shot from only a few meters away. It struck the lead Panzer's track assembly, locking it in place. Crane lobbed a grenade that rattled against the rear tank's engine vents. The Germans panicked immediately. Engines roared, infantry scattered. The tanks tried to rotate but hit trees. Every movement created blind spots. Every blind spot became an opening. The Canadians shifted positions in the dark with uncanny speed, firing from 3 directions in less than a minute. The forest echoed with explosions, cracking wood, and the frantic shouts of German crews who had no idea how many attackers surrounded them. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the Canadians vanished into the trees, leaving behind a crippled armored column and men who would swear the forest had swallowed the enemy whole. The next morning, Hale listened to German radio chatter intercepted by Allied intelligence. One line stood out, spoken by a Panzer commander whose voice trembled. "They don't fight like men," he said. "They fight like the land itself." Hale folded his arms and stared into the woods. He didn't believe in poetry, but he understood the sentiment. The Canadians weren't trying to be terrifying. They were simply doing their job. But the more effective they became, the more fear grew in the minds of the men they hunted. And that fear, once planted, spread like wildfire through the German ranks. As July bled into August, the ambushes intensified. The Germans prepared for them, expected them, dreaded them. Yet the Canadians always seemed to be one move ahead. And the Panzer crews knew that somewhere out there, in the mist, the hedgerows or the dark forests, the silent hunters were already choosing their next kill. By late summer, the fear of Canadian tank hunters had soaked into the German ranks so deeply that even the sound of snapping branches could send crews scrambling for hatch handles. Yet fear alone did not explain the growing caution inside Panzer divisions. It was the battles themselves, the brutal close-quarters clashes where steel met steel and the unexpected became routine, that finally convinced German commanders they were facing an enemy unlike any other. These were not chance ambushes, not lucky shots. not flukes born of terrain. They were the result of a deliberate, disciplined, relentless fighting force that had refined tank hunting into both art and science. The first of these decisive engagements unfolded in the rolling fields outside Falaise, where dust hung in the air thick as wool and the horizon shimmered with heat. The German retreat was accelerating, and their armor was desperate to break through the tightening Allied noose. Canadian regiments were tasked with holding several crucial crossroads. If the Germans punched through even one, the escape corridor would widen and thousands of enemy troops might slip away. Lieutenant Marcus Hale stood beside a burned-out Canadian Sherman, its turret bent like peeled metal from a direct hit. He wiped sweat from his brow and studied the landscape ahead. Wheat swayed in the wind, hiding dips and folds that could conceal enemy armor. Farther off, a plume of dust rose steadily. Crane squinted through binoculars. Mark IVs, and something heavier behind them. Whitaker tightened the strap on his PIAT. How many? 4 at least. Crane lowered the glasses. And a Tiger. The men around them stiffened. A Tiger tank was a different beast entirely. Its armor shrugged off the PIAT unless struck at vulnerable angles. Its gun could split a Sherman in half. Its presence alone could freeze entire platoons. Hale didn't flinch. We stop them here. If they get past this ridge, the road behind us is finished. The Canadians prepared their positions with a calm precision that had become their hallmark. They were not hiding in hedgerows this time. They were not stalking through forests. This would be an open fight, a duel against armored giants, and the chances of walking away were slimmer than ever. Whitaker knelt behind a pile of broken stone from an old farm wall. He adjusted the PIAT's angle and glanced at Crane. If the Tiger spots us first, we're gone. Crane nodded. Then we make sure it doesn't. As the German column advanced, the earth trembled beneath their treads. Birds scattered from the fields. The air grew tight, heavy with the smell of fuel and dust. The Mark IVs spread out, flanking the Tiger, which moved with the slow confidence of something nearly invincible. Inside the lead Panzer, a German commander surveyed the ridge and muttered, "This is Canadian ground. Stay alert." His driver swallowed hard and replied, "They always choose the worst moment to strike." They were right to worry. Hale gave the signal. The first shot came from an Allied anti-tank gun positioned behind a haystack. It roared, sending a shell slamming into the lead Mark IV, punching a deep crater into its turret. The tank jerked sideways, flames licking out through the hatch. German infantry scattered. Whitaker and Crane moved next. As the Tiger shifted its angle to hunt the anti-tank gun, its left flank briefly exposed itself. Crane whispered, "There's your shot." Whitaker inhaled, steadied his aim, and fired. The Piat bomb streaked across the wheat field and struck the Tiger's turret ring. It didn't penetrate fully, but it jammed the turret with a shriek of grinding metal. Smoke belched from its vents. Inside the Tiger, the commander cursed loudly. "Turret stuck! They hit us in the ring!" The Canadians dove behind the stones as German machine guns raked the ridge. Dirt exploded around them. Crane felt a bullet graze the top of his boot. Whitaker rolled into a shallow depression, clutching another PIAT round. Hale shouted to shift positions. The Canadians moved like ghosts, rising through the wheat. Every few seconds, another Piat or anti-tank gun fired. Each shot aimed deliberately, each impact chipping away at German armor and morale. The battle was chaos, but Canadian chaos had rhythm. The Germans tried to press forward, but the jammed Tiger slowed the column. A second anti-tank gun, hidden behind a low ridge, hit a Mark IV square in the rear armor. The explosion tore the tank open, sending a plume of fire upward. Panicked German radio chatter spilled through the air. "We're surrounded by them. They're everywhere. We cannot see them." Hale watched the Tiger struggle to rotate. Its massive gun remained pointed uselessly off to the side. "Whitaker," Hale shouted. "One more hit! Disable the track!" Whitaker crawled through the wheat, stomach scraping the earth, until he found the perfect angle. The Tiger's right track assembly was exposed, its armored skirt bent from the earlier impact. Crane whispered, "If this fails..." "If it fails, we're done," Whitaker replied. "But it won't." He steadied the PIAT, braced it hard against the ground, and pulled the trigger. The thump echoed like thunder. The bomb struck the Tiger's track with a violent burst, snapping half the links and locking the machine in place. The massive tank bucked, then listed to one side, unable to move. The German crew erupted in panic. "Track is gone! We're immobilized! Infantry, protect the tank!" But it was already too late. The immobilized Tiger became a beacon for every Canadian weapon on the field. Machine gun fire forced the German infantry to ground. Mortar rounds exploded around the crippled armor. Even Sherman tanks from farther down the ridge joined the fight, maneuvering to punish the paralyzed giant. Within minutes, the German advance collapsed. 2 Mark IVs burned fiercely. A third retreated, limping backward. The Tiger, unable to rotate or maul, finally popped open its hatches as the surviving crew threw themselves into the wheat, stumbling toward safety. The Canadians had done what most Allied units could only dream of. They had beaten a Tiger in open combat. As the smoke thinned, Crane sat down heavily, panting. Whitaker dropped the PIAT beside him and rubbed his aching shoulder. Hale approached, his uniform covered in dust and streaked with sweat. "You two just stopped a breakthrough that could have cost hundreds of lives," Hale said. "That Tiger crew will be telling stories about you for the rest of their lives." Whitaker gave a tired smile. "As long as they keep running, I'll take it." But the battles that built the Canadians' fearsome reputation were not only large set-piece clashes. Some of the most terrifying encounters occurred in ruined cities where steel echoed off stone and every street was a killing ground. One such fight erupted in Caen, where narrow roads wound between broken houses and collapsed roofs. German armor tried to dislodge Canadian positions block by block. The city looked like a graveyard of shattered stone. Smoke hung in the air so thick it tasted metallic. Inside one ruined apartment building, Whitaker waited at a second-floor window with a PIAT balanced on a stack of broken furniture. Crane spotted a Mark IV creeping down the street, its turret scanning overhead. "They think the threat is above," Crane whispered. "They aren't looking at the windows yet." Whitaker fired downward, the shot hitting the top of the Panzer's engine deck. Flames burst instantly, and the crew bailed out, coughing through the smoke. Another German tank reversed wildly, smashing into a wall. A second PIAT team hit its exposed underside as it climbed over rubble. The street became a choke point. The Canadians turned each collapsed building into a fortress, each window into a firing position. One German officer reportedly shouted over the radio, "Every street has a Canadian waiting in it. We cannot advance anywhere without being ambushed." The phrase spread. It was repeated in battalion briefings, whispered in tank turrets, scribbled in diaries found on fallen soldiers. German commanders were forced to admit that the Canadians understood urban warfare in a way they had underestimated. By the final weeks of the Normandy campaign, Canadian tank hunters had earned a reputation that bordered on myth. German intelligence circulated warnings that the maple leaf insignia meant trouble. Panzer crews were told to expect ambushes in terrain that seemed too quiet, too empty, too easy. The psychological toll was immense. One German commander summed it up bluntly during a debrief after Falaise. The Americans attack with strength. The British attack with discipline. But the Canadians, he said, shaking his head, the Canadians hunt. They wait until you are blind, then tear out your eyes. When the retreat finally broke and German forces streamed back toward the Seine, the Canadians stood on the battered ridges and ruined fields they had fought so hard to hold. Smoke drifted across the hills. The wreckage of tanks lay twisted and blackened. The air was still. Whitaker and Crane sat together on the hood of an abandoned jeep. Crane drank from his canteen. Whitaker stretched his aching shoulder, wincing. "Think they'll come back this way?" Crane asked. Whitaker looked across the valley where the sun dipped toward the horizon. "Not while they remember what happened here." Hale approached and clapped a hand on Whitaker's back. "You earned something today," he said. "Not medals, not glory. Fear." Whitaker raised an eyebrow. "Fear?" "Fear," Hale repeated. "The kind that keeps them awake at night. The kind that follows them wherever they go. And that fear saved lives today." The valley was quiet again. No engines growled. No shells shrieked. Only the wind moved through the grass, whispering across the wreckage. Steel had met steel, and the hunters had won. And from that day forward, whenever German commanders heard they were facing Canadians, they remembered the fields of Falaise, the streets of Caen, the darkness of the forests, and the silent men with the PIAT who turned even the strongest tanks into prey.